I think sometimes when you work for a very large company, you just really have no idea until you experience it, for yourself. If you want to build a successful and in my opinion, a sustainable architectural practice, because without profitability, the architecture practice is not going to be sustainable. One of the most compassionate things that we can do for our people is to run a successful and financially profitable business.
Hello, Architect Nation, and welcome back. Enoch Sears here, founding principal at Business of Architecture. If you're running a practice, you know the creative work is the fun part, but managing cash flow, forecasting revenue, and understanding profitability, well, that certainly can feel soul sucking. Here at Business of Architecture and here on the show, our goal is to make architecture enjoyable again. And I was quite pleased when I had the reach out from a potential podcast guest, a Mr. Ryan Mayhugh, who happens to be a senior project accountant at HOK. He wanted to come on the show because he'd had the opportunity to help scale a small architectural practice to over 40 people that was later acquired. He also had the opportunity to have worked in some of the largest architectural practices, including Gensler and HOK, where he now works. So excited to have him here on the show to get a non-architect's view of the financial side of practice management. So if you've ever been frustrated by project finances that just don't add up, maybe you're wondering if growing your firm will actually make you more money or just tie a ball and chain around your foot, or maybe you feel totally in the dark about how big firms seem to run like clockwork. Well, it seems like your life is a life of never-ending chaos. On today's episode, you'll discover how this insider says and why he says most architects are flying blind, and the critical financial that you're probably missing, the data. The counterintuitive budgeting approach that helped the Scrappy startup grow to 40 people and later get acquired by a multi-billion-dollar firm, and what small firm owners can steal from the Genslers and the HOKs of the world without selling your soul or your design integrity. In today's episode, I sit down with Ryan Mayhugh, a seasoned architecture finance veteran who helped grow the Lamar Johnson Collaborative from a scrappy startup to a 40-person firm that was later acquired, all after nearly a decade at Gensler. Now, serving as a senior project accountant at HOK, Ryan joins us to bring sharp insight into what small firms can learn from the financial playbook of the giants. Now, before we get into that, let me remind you, if you're building everyone else's dreams while yours collect dust, it's time for the Smart Practice Method Masterclass. This free video masterclass is yours as a podcast listener. It's your blueprint for eliminating overwhelm and slaying chaos as a small firm owner. It's time to stop drawing up excuses. Start designing your ideal practice today. Go to smartpracticemethod.com to get access to this free video. Now, stay tuned for today's episode. This one is packed with gold. Ryan, welcome to the Business of Architecture.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Ryan, you've seen architecture firms at every stage, from global giants like Gensler and HOK, where you're at currently, to a scrappy startup, shall we say. What's one thing that you find that small firm owners consistently underestimate about managing the financial side of projects?
I think on the smaller side, firm owners, I don't know if it's necessarily underestimating. I think it's a lot of times it can be a matter of where the focus, lies, and a lot of times, the focus is on winning projects, cool projects. I want to do the work and not prioritizing the, financial, infrastructure, backbone, those kind of things. So to really put good financial intelligence together, um, and what I've kind of found, um, at least among some of the smaller firms, it can be really hard for them to even prepare, good financial data on some of these things, just because it's just a matter of prioritization. Um, a lot of times, and of course, like that's not speaking for all smaller firms, but um, I think that definitely the priority, tends to be, I want to win this cool work and and work on really cool projects, and so um, I think I think one of the things that can really help out, small firm owners is, a lot of times what I've seen at some of the small firms, I think it would really help if they had somebody in-house that at least kind of had a good financial accounting background, to the extent that they have that luxury. I mean, some folks are a sole proprietor, um, but, I think a lot of times there's, an overly reliance on or a lot of times they'll take a focus on, "Okay, we can't afford this overhead right now," and my attitude about it is, I don't think you can afford not to have that overhead, And so, yes, we need the key we need to make the key strategic hire of you're trying to get into a particular market or some senior leadership at, architecture, but I think that having some senior leadership on the financial end of it should be a priority as well. And a lot of times I just don't think that is a priority for some of the smaller firms. And so,
It's definitely a very tenuous pull, the desire to do the challenging, fulfilling design work, and then also making sure the numbers work, making sure that the profits coming in, employees can be paid for, investments can be made.
yeah.
Ryan, you had a very interesting pedigree, and I'm just so glad to have you here today because you went from a middle management position at Gensler, where you had a very stable, solid career there, jumped over with someone who left Gensler to help start up a startup practice, Lamar Johnson Collaborative. So you got to see being part of the largest architectural practice in the world to being part of a startup. And I would love to hear your insights about what are some surprises that surprised you as you because it's a very different thing starting up a startup practice, small firm versus being part of a large organization.
One of the biggest things that shocked me was the barrier to entry when it comes to technology and licensing costs. Yeah, I had no insight into that given my position that I had, at Gensler. And so, when you're starting a firm and you're building out your technology infrastructure, your Revit license, Bluebeam, all these different things. I mean, it was really shocking to see how much those things cost. Um, and then plus, when you're a smaller firm, you don't have the leverage of certain economies of scale. So it's kind of you pay what you pay, kind of thing. Um, and so that was really a shock. Um, and I think another surprise, for me, is when you work for a very large firm, you tend to, sometimes you can get kind of specialized and and just to be a little humble about it, I did not know a lot that I had to learn. A lot of times late nights, weekends where I saw it was like, oh, I'm coming from, Gensler and I know this and this and this and this. And I did know a lot about a particular area of the business. And when you work for a startup, it was just me in the accounting department from until we grew a little bit and I was able to hire somebody. So you're building everything from scratch. And that can be, I mean, that can be really, challenging to do because in addition to getting your day-to-day job done, as you're having to plan for the future, you know, what kind of metrics do I want to be able to see? You're just basically building everything. But I do think one of the advantages that our group we did have was that we knew what good looked like coming from where we came from. So we at least kind of knew we weren't just kinda shooting blind, we had to build it and we were, necessarily not sure how to build it. We were kind of learning along the way, but we at least knew what we were going to trying to get to. And so, um, and I think that the big surprise, for me was just, yeah, there's a lot of hours, a lot of certain challenges that come along with starting a business that, um I think sometimes when you work for a very large company, you just really have no idea until you experience it, for yourself. And so it was quite the learning lesson.
Yeah, I can imagine. The challenges of a large firm are so different from a small firm. So it's amazing that you have that incredible experience of both of them. Ryan, when you started off the interview here, you kind of mentioned that one of your recommendations is that a small firm needs to have someone with financial acumen. You mentioned that that is an essential criteria. And I'd like to ask you why. Explain to us, like in layman's terms, why is that such an important recommendation from your perspective?
When you're starting from, let's say, the very beginning, you're starting, a business, you have a small business, that hire, or at least if you don't have the luxury of making that hire, but the willingness to learn those aspects, setting up good practices at the very beginning lays the success for the future. For example, if a smaller firm makes the wrong decision on what accounting software to use, ERP platform to use, and then you win a project in Europe, but your software doesn't have multi-currency, it's so much harder to make that change later. But then also while you're building a new firm, you have there's no history of financial metrics or those kind of things. So you need somebody that can kind of rationalize that financial information, to kind of, measure certain progress. And really, and plus just the day-to-day, nuts and bolts of, managing, good books. I mean, I can say that, um, we were able to, we were able to produce quality books from, day one when I was at the startup. The numbers didn't admittedly did not look pretty at first, when we just got started, but I was one of the early employees, and they made that a priority to understand the numbers, understanding the business side. Um, and and I think that it's and also I think as a firm owner, I understand that that can be kind of an expensive hire, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of value in, say, the firm owner's, time as well. You need to be able to spend a lot of your time marketing projects, winning work, and everything else. And if you're managing the day-to-day administrative burden of the finances as well, it can be, really hard to do. Um, and I think that having good, uh, key financial metrics to be able to look at, and also have good historical data as you're building a firm, so you can know how to price certain projects moving forward. You can actually measure your success over time. I think it's just vital, um, if you want to build a successful and in my opinion, a sustainable architectural practice. Because without profitability, the architecture practice is not going to be sustainable. I think that's really, some of the reasons why it's just, vital. And then plus I think when you're also hiring new staff, certain project managers, architects, those kind of things. Um, I think it is helpful having somebody that can help educate the rest of the staff as well on some of the business criteria, some of the business metrics. I know, different firms have different philosophies on, financial transparency. I'm a firm believer in financial transparency. I think it's key to get buy-in from from our employees if we're financially transparent about the results of the company. And I think that it is important to have somebody that can, also help teach the rest of the staff. I mean, the people that are making the day-to-day decisions on projects, so they can kind of understand the decisions that they make, how they may affect the overall financial performance of the project. And so,
Tell me about financial transparency. What do you mean? What would it look like to be fully financially transparent the way that you see it's beneficial?
yeah, which again, that's one of the great things when when you're one of the early employees at a startup where you can just build something and, we want to do this and have the power to do exactly what you want to do. Um, I mean, really, financial transparency for me, it's being transparent about the overall firm's financial performance, and also on a project by project basis. Um, and and again, like I said, every firm has, a lot of firms have different philosophies around this. And I can't speak for every small firms, but I have seen, some smaller firms that are just very closed off on the financial aspect of it. And I don't think that is a good approach. Simply if you have a project manager and they don't have an understanding of the financial performance of the actual projects, how can they actually be, a sufficient project manager? But I also think it's important to understand on a day-to-day level how their work can impact the financial performance. And it also, if the company is transparent with everybody, in the company, they can understand, okay, maybe here's why my bonus wasn't what I wanted it to be, or we had a great year. Thank you so much. This is much better than I thought it was going to be. And I think that, one of the things that, I think, Gensler, 'cause that's where I started my career. They were It's not confidential. They're very open, with their financials and, among employees. And I think, uh, part of that, helps get buy-in from their employees because they can see how the financial performance impacts their own compensation. And I think that that is something that, um, I don't know why a lot of firms are so hesitant to share that information. I have heard certain things that, um, where sometimes firm owners are, "Oh, our people don't wanna be we want our people focused on design and not the numbers," those kinda things. Um, but I think sometimes that, they underestimate their staff on what they wanna know and want to learn about things. And I think I just think it's very important, also because those folks are gonna be the future leaders of the firm as well, and they're gonna have to have an understanding of how to manage a profitable business, um, and I don't think the industry does ourselves any favors if we don't share that information.
Ryan, tell me about your current job duties. What does it entail? Give me a picture of what data did you get? What do you do with it? And where does it go to?
Yeah, so, yeah, day to day currently, you know, I manage the, earnings on a portfolio of projects, certain amount of invoicing, so, of course, help with cash flow, um, help the project managers, report accurate financial earnings, ensuring that we're not over-earning or under-earning. Of course, I look at a variety of financial metrics, project profitability metrics, multipliers, those kind of things, project plans, try to help identify certain trends, to see, okay, did we do something that's out of scope? Do we need an ad service? What's going on here? And so really my current job, I view my current role as a customer service role to our project managers. And so, I try to help them out with the administrative and financial burdens of their projects. And then, of course, also a lot of day-to-day interactions with clients and, ensuring that we get paid timely and those kind of things.
And so when there is a red flag on a project, is it you that first notices it, or what's the process for identifying that, well, this project's going downhill. We need to step in here to avoid a major financial loss?
Yeah, I think, I think my approach, I mean, it's really a combination, of several, factors. I think larger firms, there's definitely more of a focus on financial performance than some of the smaller ones. So we have a variety of tools to help catch, certain things. So, a lot of times it's the project manager bringing something to, my attention, but also a lot of times accounting, finance, we're bringing it to their attention as well. Because we have access to, a lot of cases, real time financial data. And so one of the areas that I particularly like to look at is one thing. The architects probably they'll get tired of hearing me say this, but one thing I tell our folks here a lot, it's easy for me to tell you how we're currently doing, but it's much more difficult to understand where we're heading. And so one of the big focuses on project planning. And so we can kind of see, and that's, I mean, that is so helpful to have good financial planning on the project as well. So we can understand it's like, okay, we're doing well right now, but when we get to construction administration, we're going to have a problem based on this, financial plan. So maybe we need to staff the project differently. What's driving that? Is there a schedule extension that we need to ask for additional money for? And really that's the value of having the good business intelligence, because a lot of times we can see those risks into the future before there are problems, instead of trying to address them after the fact. And that's one thing I definitely can see it, some of the smaller folks, I think that, uh, smaller firms that can struggle with is being reactive to problems instead of proactive, to them. It's like, "Oh, we've got a problem. How are we going to" well, the problem happened 6 months ago. And, and that's really another reason, go back to hiring, good finance person that also understands the importance of the financial tools that are available to architecture and engineering firms, and understanding the importance of project planning. And project planning is something that just constantly has to be reinforced, the importance of it. And And I think and it's kind of hit or miss, like I said, I can't speak for every single firm. At the larger firms, including, my current firm, um, we do a pretty good job of those, but I know that there's some smaller ones that there's no focus on it at all. Um, and so, yeah. And I think that if you're not focusing on the planning aspect, you have no way of knowing where you're gonna be at in 6 months.
That is such an important critical point there, Ryan, is the ability to forecast, to be able to see and zig or zag, adjust based upon the data. Because we do see that so many firms, especially the small firms, are completely reactive because they're hitting those tidal waves instead of actually seeing them 6 months in advance and being able to plan. So there's a couple things there that happen. Number one, they don't have the forecasting in place. They can't even see the tidal wave coming. And number two, even if they did, they lack the strategy. They don't even know what to do. So a lot of times it's easier to put our heads in the sand than actually face the unhappy or unpleasant financial picture, because that just feels better in the moment. When you were with Lamar Johnson Collaborative at the beginning, what were some of the challenges that you felt yourself facing in the finance role? You mentioned high costs for tools and licensing. Other than that,
Cash flow. I mean, the big priority, day one, I mean, cash flow. Admittedly, we had to focus on cash flow over profitability at the very beginning. Of course, especially as you're trying to build a brand and a name in the marketplace. Admittedly, some of the earlier projects that we had, were not the big financial money makers, those kind of things. So it was cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. I mean, I was on the phone all the time, with clients, where, yes, the larger firms, of course, cash flow, days sales outstanding, those are very important metrics. We track those too, but it's a completely different ballgame when you're at a startup firm, and it is the difference between maybe you making payroll or not. And I think that I remember one of the big challenges that, I had it. And so, because of course, I come from, I came from the large firm, and I remember, my first week or so, and I'm getting access to the checking account, at the startup firm, and I look in there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I make this work? And I was like, I hope I'm as smart as they think I am, um, and and I think that those are obviously some of the biggest challenges. There are real considerable financial challenges that smaller firms face. Um, You know, however, I will go back to the whole thing of being like, you know, you're always gonna have those challenges if you don't put in the successful steps at the very beginning. It's much easier to put those things in place while you're small, make it part of your culture, and then as you grow. And I think, another huge challenge here was just the sheer amount of things that have to be done, and especially when your bar is a firm that's been around for decades and the technology and everything like that. So we're looking at like, this is what I need, and this is what I have. And that stress can be kind of overwhelming because, day to day you may think you're failing. Um, in a reality, I think, one of the steps, the tools to just kind of get around that stress is really just, um, putting together, a longer term plan, and just, checking in, weekly on, here are 3 things I can get done this week. And then 6 months from now, you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, we got a ton accomplished, instead of just focusing on how are we going to get all of this done. And when we were hiring people early on the project, these are people that I had, prior professional relationships with. These were friends, folks with families. They were taking a big risk, leaving a very large, profitable, established firm, leadership positions there. And when you're in a leadership position, I'm sure as you know, um, there's a lot of benefits to that. But one of the things that can weigh on you is you feel a responsibility to take care of your people. And that really is a stress. And so, my role was helping the firm owners understand, get to profitability as quickly as possible. And that's also, it was a big motivator, but also a huge stress, when you feel individually responsible for the livelihoods of those of people you care about.
Yeah, that concern is real.
Yeah.
It's authentic. It's something that every business owner, I'm sure, is familiar with. You don't want to lay people off. You understand that your decisions really impact people's ability to maybe get Christmas presents that year or send their kid to a private school or something like that. That really has an impact. Ryan, you mentioned a couple things that small firm owners should get into place, and I wanted to ask you what you've already kind of hinted at this and you've talked a little bit about it, but what things would you think would be essential for a small startup firm that they absolutely need to have in place if they want to be sustainable?
I think spending a lot of time putting together a good business plan. So a lot of firms, you know, when you were doing, so let's say financial forecasting, right? You may look at like, hey, what's in the marketing pipeline? Okay, we expect to win this amount of work. Here's what our contracts are, and then from there, you're developing a forecast over time, and here's what you can afford based on this forecast. Essentially from the top down. One of the things we did when we started, the startup firm was, yes, we did that too because you have to, but we also kind of did a bottom up kind of forecast where we were deciding here's what we want to be able to pay people. Our priority was taking good care of our people, providing good benefits, providing good bonuses. Some things that we did that not a lot of architecture firms do, we paid overtime for architects that made under a certain threshold on the salary, right? So these are benefits that cost a considerable amount of money. So from there, we would have our cost. We would know what our cost is going to be over time. And then we were like, okay, we have to make this amount of money in order to have this baseline of benefits, pay, and everything else for our people. And the reason I say that that's kind of it is different than I think what a lot of firms will do. But one thing I think is important is because as you're making business decisions, okay, let's go after this project. Are we going to undercut this firm? Lower our fees or whatever. The reality is like if you know what the consequences of some of the maybe not so great business decisions that are made, you kinda think twice about making them. And I think that was one of the difference, it's like, so understanding what kind of firm that you want to be, and then putting together a plan of how you get there. I mean, one thing that, I tell folks, in the industry is one of the most compassionate things that we can do for our people is to run a successful and financially profitable business, because that's ultimately how we take care of our people. And I think a lot of architecture firms, may talk a good game, about, some of this stuff. But the reality is it really does come down to the numbers. That's how we pay for everything. And I think that when you have the flexibility to build a budget like that, where you say, here's our goals. Here's how I want to treat our people. I want us to be best in class on how we compensate our people. I want I don't want to worry about turnover. I want to be able to pay folks well. Maybe I want to give, an employee ownership stake. And and then from there, you decide, okay, here's what we have to make profitability. Here's how much revenue we have to bring in. Here's the amount of projects we have to win. And that sets the goal. And and then you also have a clear understanding of what the consequences are if either you don't hit that goal or maybe you decide to pivot and to a different direction. It's like, okay, if we bid after this job that we're going to spend $250,000 marketing and we have 10% chance of winning it. If we don't win it, the consequences, we can't pay out our profit sharing this year, and really understanding what that is. And I just think it really does help to make better business decisions.
Ryan, what have you seen put into place to where people don't feel like the attention of finances is the stern father or mother? It's the tyrannical top down. You got to make these numbers. How do you get around that feeling that people may experience of resistance or feeling like they're not measuring up when there is such a strong structure in place? What have you seen effective to encourage high morale while at the same time high accountability?
Yeah. Well, I think it's at some firms, there seems to be an attitude, and and I don't know why that is, obviously because I'm an accounting and finance person, but there seems to be an attitude in the architecture industry as a whole that they equate, you know, good design as being less profitable, right? It's like if you want to achieve the highest levels of design, you can't focus on, profitability. And admittedly, sometimes at the smaller firms, the larger firms can be a little demonized a little bit because of that. And I've never bought that. I have never agreed with that at all. And I think that, so to your point, there is a natural resistance that, a little bit there. But I also think that this is where I think the financial transparency does help and play a role, like where, um, you know, if if we make financial performance part of the firm's culture, then and we're transparent about the results, then folks on an individual level can see how their compensation, comes accordingly. And it doesn't mean that you're producing bad work. I mean, different project types are naturally going to have different profit margins, but um, and I think that, but I also think some of that resistance, can come from a place like where I see this a lot when it comes to finance. People, maybe a little bit of antagonistic role between architects and finance executives at time. But I think that my approach with that is that's always been my entire motivation, because I love this industry, but my entire motivation is at the end of the year, I want to be able to pay our folks as much money as we can, provide a good bonuses, and continue paying good benefits. That's why I drive home, these things. And I think that if you're the people that work at the firm, they believe that about you, I think there's definitely gonna be more buy-in. Um, and it's also like, an education, aspect, because I think as a finance person, if part of the job should also be to help architects understand that there's a real financial value to the services that you provide. Sometimes there's a hesitation talking about money or different things like this. And so, and ultimately, I spend a lot of time educating, the architects, on these particular things. And I think if folks understand that how this ultimately impacts the financial performance and then also helps benefit them in their careers, I think that also helps get some buy-in. But a lot of it just also has to do with trust as well. Um, do 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 they trust the leadership, and because it doesn't have to be an antagonistic relationship. I think finance and the architects can be more of a partnership kind of thing.
Ryan, in your opinion, what are the top 3 strategies or things that small firm owners should adopt based upon the practices of large firms?
That's a good question. Making financial performance part of the culture of the firm, at least an understanding of what the numbers are. Also, I think it's important for this, a smaller firm, especially when you're starting out, uh, to to identify what your brand is and be, have a consistent, brand. I mean, the larger firms are very consistent about, you know, managing their brand. And I think that, um, especially early on in the process, it can be difficult to identify what that ultimate brand is going to be for your firm, or what your area of specialty is going to be. Um, and 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 I know it's going to, sound cheesy, but it's also when you work for a smaller company, especially a startup architecture firm, the reality is there's likely going to be a lot of hours involved. So if you tend to hire people, of course, you're hiring them for their areas of expertise, but you also kind of have to hire for certain, culture fit, because you're going to be spending so much time, like with them. One of the things that one of the things that I really think that made uh, Lamar Johnson Collaborative successful as quickly as we were. I mean, we hired good people, um, but we genuinely liked each other. We were all kind of like rowing in the direction. We definitely didn't make that leap for money. you know, um, and and I think that especially when you're in a startup space, you're in a cramped little space and you're spending that much time, I mean, you really have to like the people that you work with and have, a lot of the same, goals. And, and I think I mean, that really is, key. You know, when you're spending that much time, with people and I think that, um, but really, I mean, some of the other practices, of large architecture firms, like a focus on the forecasting piece of it. It's so important. And admittedly, it's not an exact science. It can be kind of hard. But one piece of advice I will give smaller firms, a little bit when it comes to the forecasting piece is, you have to, uh, like the larger firms, for example, if you're forecasting, we may discount fees a little bit. Okay, we think that we're going to win this, so maybe we discount by a probability of like 50%. Well, when you're at a small firm, I don't necessarily agree with the discounting method because if you put in a proposal for $1 million project, it's either 100% or 0. It's like when you're a small firm, that can be the difference between you staying in business or not, right? And I think that, the forecasting piece is it's so important. And I think that's also I think it kinda helps to have a person with a good financially minded person to be kind of a check and balance when it comes to that forecasting piece. Because I think admittedly, sometimes, the design directors and architects, can be, overly optimistic about a forecast. And in fairness, finance people like me are overly pessimistic about forecasts. And inevitably, what ended up happening is somewhere in the middle. And I think, the forecasting piece is just it's vital, I think, to a successful practice. And it's I think the hardest part to really ingrain in part of the culture of a company. Um, and part of it, you have to have good tools, but you also just have to understand the data that you're looking at.
Very, very, very solid advice. And Ryan, I do have a follow-up question. You mentioned
No
branding
problem.
was your number two. I got to ask this question because our listeners probably
Yeah.
are too. A lot
Yep.
of times, small firm practitioners, what we find is a lot of times people think about branding as the logo, the way your business cards look, the way your website looks. But branding is so much more expansive than that. I'd like to understand from your perspective why you chose that as number two. And for you, what does brand actually mean for a firm? And then we'll wrap there.
Well, obviously, I'm speaking, as a finance person, but another one of the great things about working for for a small company when you're just building things, you're involved in all kinds of different aspects. And I think, y- y- you know, to your point, yes, part of it is what is your logo going to be, what's your color, it's going to be your font, going to be those kind of things. But I think your ultimate brand is going to be what is your firm known for? Like, what is your special sauce, essentially? I know that word is kind of overused a little bit. And in being consistent, with that, it's like, okay, what is your firm gonna be known for? Are you gonna be, experts in this particular marketplace where clients will just continue to come back to you for that particular work? And there's nothing wrong with being the absolute best in a particular small area. Or, just like there's nothing wrong with doing it all. But I think it's you really have to understand what your core competencies are and double down on it. I really think that, um, it's better to be experts in a handful of areas than average in a bunch of them. And I think, being able to market yourself as those subject matter experts really can help your business because a lot of times you're not spending time marketing, and just being consistent with that message and also you, having leadership that goes out and gets out in the public, various conferences, speaking, events that helps, get your firm's name out there and your employees and partners as these are the subject matter experts. Um, I know that there's a variety of firms out there, and uh, depending on the project type that, you know if it's a hospital project, for example, there's a high likelihood it's going to go to one of 5 firms, because and they've earned that kind of reputation, and I think that that's a big part of it.
Thank you, Ryan. Ryan, today we've been joined by Ryan Mayhugh. He's currently working as a senior project accountant at HOK out of the Washington, D.C. office. Ryan, thank you for deciding to come back and give back to the podcast.
All right. No problem. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And here is today's Smart Practice tool tip. Architect Nation, here's a financial truth bomb. Most architecture firms are collecting just 60 to 70% of what they could be earning on every project. Now, I know you may not care about money, but if you do, I can guarantee you're doing the work, you're bearing the stress, you're carrying the liability, but possibly leaving $250,000 or more on the table annually without even knowing it. Would that be important to find out? That's why we developed the Smart Practice Revenue Capacity Planner tool. It's a 30-minute financial checkup that shows you exactly how much money your firm could be earning right now, so you can compare it with what your current performance is. Get this Smart Practice tool 100% free by going to businessofarchitecture.com/capacity. And thank you to our recent listeners who left reviews for the podcast on iTunes. Your reviews help others find this podcast so that the rising tide raises all boats. To be acknowledged on the show, open up the app on your iPhone, search for Business of Architecture, and after clicking on the show, scroll all the way to the bottom to leave a review. Today's episode of the Business of Architecture show is sponsored by Smart Practice, the world's leading step-by-step solution for small firm owners that want to structure their existing practice so the complexity of business doesn't get in the way of the architecture. Quit doing it the old way, because you see it likely isn't your architecture skills that are holding you back. It may be all those business aspects of running a practice, managing projects and people, creating invoices, chasing late payments, dealing with clients, contractors, and money. So if you're ready to stop being a glorified administrator and get back to the architecture you love again, go to smartpracticemethod.com and discover the proven, simple, and easy to implement Smart Practice method that is revolutionizing firm management for owners and teams. And as always, I would like to thank you for joining us today and remind you that the views expressed on this show by our guests do not represent those of the host, and we make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you conquer the world. Carpe diem.